Hey biology students, welcome to the virtual lecture on photosynthesis part 1. In this video we're going to be learning about photosynthesis, which is a metabolic pathway, just like cellular respiration that we learned in the previous module. And you'll notice if you take a look at the summary equation, it's actually the reverse of cellular respiration. The reactants of photosynthesis are actually carbon dioxide and water, and a plant is able to use those reactants to build glucose and also releasing oxygen in the process. So in a simple sense, to summarize what's going on here, a plant is using sunlight energy to build carbon dioxide from the atmosphere into a bigger molecule, and that bigger molecule is glucose. The plant can then convert that glucose into any other biomolecule it wants, whether that's sucrose, starch, a fat, or a protein. So this is the way that plants and algae are able to build their own food. And since we're building a bigger molecule, this type of metabolic pathway requires energy to do so. So this is referred to as an endergonic process, an energy requiring process. If you remember back to the start of the last module, we talked about the various ways that organisms on Earth can acquire energy from their surrounding environments. We've already covered one of these two ways, which is to say that some organisms can acquire energy by consuming food and then subsequently breaking down that food to release its energy so they can build ATP. So that's one way. There is another way, which we're going to learn about here in this video, and that is that some organisms can actually absorb sunlight energy and use that energy to build their own food without having to consume others. So that's what we're going to be talking about here in this video. And we have a name for the specific type of organisms that can harness the power of the sun to build their own food. We refer to them as photoautotrophs. Autotrophs meaning the organism can build their own food. Photo referring to sunlight. So we're saying that they use sunlight to build their own food. Examples of organisms that are photoautotrophs include all plants and also many protists, including single-celled algae. There's all different types of algae. There's green algae, brown algae, red algae. And that also includes seaweed, also known as kelp. So those are the major photoautotrophs. It's worth noting that some bacteria also have the ability to undergo photosynthesis, but we're primarily going to focus on plants. So we're going to ask a few important questions here. The first is, actually we just answered this, what type of organisms do photosynthesis? I'll say it again. These are the photoautotrophs. Again, that includes all plants, also single-celled green algae, and multicellular seaweed, which is also a type of algae. Our next question is, specifically referring to plants, within which organ of a plant does photosynthesis primarily occur in? The answer would be the leaves. So most of what we're going to be talking about here in this module is occurring inside a leaf. Our next question is, where does photosynthesis occur within a plant cell? The answer is within an organelle called the chloroplast. So whereas the majority of cellular respiration occurred within the mitochondria, photosynthesis is going to be occurring in a different organelle called the chloroplast. And that is an organelle that is unique to the photoautotrophs. Our last major question here is, what is the overall goal of photosynthesis from the perspective of the photoautotroph that's doing it. What are they looking to get out of this? And the answer is they're looking to get energy. They're looking to build food. They're looking to build biomolecules. So the goal is to build carbohydrates like glucose. It's very important to note that that's not the last step in a photoautotroph acquiring energy. Yes, it can build its own food using sunlight, but after that, it has to break down the food that it just built. So what I'm saying is photoautotrophs have to undergo both photosynthesis and cellular respiration. So a plant would take that glucose that it just constructed, and then it would take it to the mitochondria and break it right back down so it can generate ATP. So we're going to take a moment here to go through a diagram. And we've done a diagram very similar to this. The one that we did previously was called the basic flow of energy through a heterotroph. This diagram is very similar, except that it is the basic flow of energy through a photoautotroph. So I've given you an example of a plant. Here it's a local plant, California sagebrush. I also included some seaweed and some algae. And that's just to say that, well, not only do plants undergo photosynthesis, but also algae do as well. And so does kelp. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to practice writing out the summary equation of photosynthesis. So remember, there's two reactants. So we're going to write those out on the left side here. One of the reactants is carbon dioxide, which a plant acquires from the atmosphere. The other is water, which most plants acquire from the soil via their roots. Another necessary component in order for photosynthesis to occur is sunlight, which we're going to learn is a specific form of energy called radiation. So photoautotrophs are able to use the energy from sunlight, use water, and use CO2 to build carbohydrates like glucose. So glucose is the major product, but they also give off oxygen as well. And that's really important to other organisms, specifically all heterotrophs, because if you didn't have photoautotrophs releasing oxygen as a byproduct of photosynthesis, we wouldn't be here, because we can't break down our food. We can't do cellular respiration without oxygen in the atmosphere. And the reason that there's oxygen in the atmosphere is because we have plants, seaweed, and algae constantly undergoing photosynthesis. Now I want to label one more part here, and I just want to say that this process of photosynthesis occurs, as we said before, in an organelle called a chloroplast. And if we're talking about plants, the cells that contain large amounts of chloroplasts are concentrated in the leaves. So the leaves are the primary location where photosynthesis occurs. All right, so that's the first step in the flow of energy through a photoautotroph. They're able to take sunlight energy and convert that into a different form of energy, the energy of food, chemical energy, and they produce glucose. Then the next thing a plant needs to do, like I said a few moments ago, is they have to break down that food just like an animal has to. They have to do cellular respiration within their mitochondria. So that's step 2. We're going to say, as we already learned, that this occurs in a different organelle called the mitochondria. And we learned quite a bit about this process, so we're not going to discuss it again in great detail, but it's the breakdown of glucose, the complete breakdown of glucose within a cell, within the mitochondria, releasing its energy and generating about 32 molecules of ATP per glucose. Then the plant or the algae or the seaweed can use that ATP to carry out all of its energy requiring activities, whether that's building bigger molecules, growing, developing, communicating with the environment, everything. Okay? So that's the basic flow of energy through a photoautotroph. In this video and the next video, we're going to focus on this step right here. How is a plant able to convert visible light, which we can see with our naked eyes, into food? So how does that work? Before we move on, I have one more question for us about photosynthesis. And that question says, what are some of the ways that humans are dependent on plants and algae? And as you can see, there's a lot of answers to that question. 2 answers are of the greatest importance, meaning that if you were to take away plants and algae, you couldn't have animals and funguses and protists around, because we require photoautotrophs for 2 things. First, like I said before, they release oxygen into the atmosphere as they undergo photosynthesis, and we require that same oxygen to break down our food. So if there's no photoautotrophs, there's no animals. Second, all of the food in an ecosystem is originally derived from photoautotrophs. So if you're thinking like, well, I don't eat plants, what if I only eat animals? Like, I don't need plants around. That's not true, because even if you're eating an animal, that animal that you ate a plant, or it ate an animal that originally ate a plant. So all energy gets traced back to a plant undergoing photosynthesis. So that's really important. So photoautotrophs bring chemical energy into the ecosystem. They bring food, carbs, proteins, and fats into the ecosystem, and they make them accessible to all other organisms. So if you don't have photoautotrophs around, you don't have food at all. You don't have energy. So I would say those are 2 pretty important reasons that humans are dependent on photoautotrophs, but there's obviously others. So just to name a few, all agriculture, obviously, is dependent on plants. Also, we require food for all of our domesticated animals, whether those be cattle or sheep. So food source for them. Pretty much all of our clothing, including the clothing itself, cotton, is primarily composed of cellulose from plant cells. Also, the dyes that we use are plant-based largely. Most infrastructure and furniture, so wood, paper, most spices are plant-derived, and many beverages, including coffee, tea, beer, wine, etc. And many drugs, pharmaceutical drugs, chemotherapy drugs, are plant-based. And also, an underappreciated one is pretty much most of the energy that we use. That includes all fossil fuels. So oil, coal, and natural gas are actually the remnants of dead, ancient photosynthetic organisms. Also, biofuels, like for instance, in California, 10% of our gasoline is alcohol, ethanol, that is derived from corn that is largely grown in the Midwest and Brazil. And then various other biofuels where we use algae, for instance, as an energy source. So pretty much every aspect of your life is completely dependent on plants. But we're just going to focus here on photosynthesis. So remember a few moments ago I said that plants are really important because they bring food into every ecosystem. So we have a name for photoautotrophs because they do this. So since they bring food into the ecosystem, we call them the producers. And they truly are the foundation of every ecosystem because of that fact. Now, as you already learned in the class, there's different types of ecosystems. So for the land-based ecosystems, aka the terrestrial ecosystems, the producers are largely plants. And then if you go to aquatic ecosystems, whether that's the open ocean, a coral reef, an estuary, a lake, or a river, the primary producers in that case are algae, also known as phytoplankton. There's different types. But as you can see here, all levels of food chains depend on having photoautotrophs at the base. And if you don't have your photoautotrophs, you can't have higher levels to the food chain. Next, we're going to talk about the basic anatomy of a leaf. So here in this picture, you're looking at the cross section of a leaf. Here's the top of the leaf. Here's the interior of the leaf. And here's the bottom of the leaf. So we're going to start from the top and work our way down. We're going to discuss the various tissues or types of cells that are found within a leaf. So the first layer is not really a tissue. It's a waxy coating called the cuticle. And it's composed of waxes, which are lipids, which creates a really watertight, hydrophobic barrier that prevents water from being lost. It also protects the plant from pathogens like, viruses and bacteria. So it's almost like if you had a layer on top of your skin that further protected you from water loss and defended you. That's kind of what a leaf has. It's called the cuticle. So if you had like a waxy layer on top of your skin, that's kind of what this is. Then below that is the upper epidermis, these cells shown here in white. And those are in a sense kind of like the skin cells of the plant. Then if we move further down, it's in this interior region where photosynthesis occurs. And this interior region of the leaf, basically the inside of the leaf, is called the mesophyll. And there's two different parts of the mesophyll. We're going to start from the top. So if you look at this top layer here, you see all these vertically aligned cells packed very tightly next to one another. These cells are referred to as the palisade mesophyll. This is the primary location in which photosynthesis occurs. You can even see that these individual cells are packed full of chloroplasts. So those little green dots, each one is a chloroplast. Moving down, you see a very similar type of cell type, except the cells are a little more irregular shaped. And you'll also notice there's some air spaces in between the cells. This tissue here is called the spongy mesophyll. So there's two reasons why the cells are not as highly concentrated here. The first reason is, well, this is the top of the leaf, and sunlight is coming from this direction. So most of the sunlight is striking the top of the leaf. And sunlight is a necessary component of photosynthesis. So if you have chloroplasts that are going to be absorbing sunlight, you want most of those to be at the top of the leaf where most of the light is striking it. So that's why most photosynthesis occurs in this top layer, the palisade mesophyll. So that's one reason that this lower region near the bottom of the leaf is less concentrated. The second reason that there's space in between the cells is because a plant needs to breathe. A plant needs to exchange gases with the atmosphere in the same way that you do with your lungs. So I don't know if you've thought of this, but a plant has to inhale, in a sense, and a plant has to exhale. Now it's breathing in different molecules, but in a sense it does breathe. And it doesn't have one mouth like you do. It actually has thousands of little mouths. We don't call them mouths, we call them pores, that are located, as you can see here, in green on the bottom side of the leaf. We'll talk about those pores in greater detail in a little bit. But to finish off my point here, the reason that you have those gaps in between the cells is so you have room for instance, CO2 to move into the leaf, because it's required for photosynthesis, and for oxygen to leave the leaf. If you didn't have that space, you wouldn't have room for that process to occur, and in a sense, the plant couldn't breathe. We have another type of tissue also occurring in the interior of the leaf. It's called vascular tissue. There's two different types of vascular tissue. You may have heard of them, called xylem and phloem. Xylem transports water and minerals, largely from the roots up to the leaves. Phloem largely transports sugar, food, the products of photosynthesis throughout the plant. So if you were to look at a leaf, you can actually see the vascular tissue. Sometimes it's parallel, like if you look at a blade of grass, they're like parallel lines. And then sometimes they're branched or netted. So those veins that you're looking at, that's the vascular tissue. Then moving down, there's a bottom layer of skin, if you will, which we call the lower epidermis. And then every once in a while, there are little openings in the lower epidermis that allow for gases to be exchanged. And these openings are called stomatal pores, also known as stomata. So the pore is just a hole that creates, it basically connects the inside of the leaf with the atmosphere. So it's not really anything, it's just empty space. That's the stomatal pore. Forming that pore and controlling whether it's open or closed are two cells, which I'm circling right now. That's one, that's the other. Those cells that control the opening and closing of these pores are called guard cells. So in this picture here, we have 3 pores. 1, 2, 3. But like I said, there are hundreds to thousands on the bottom of each leaf. All right, so we've already said this, but I'll say it again. It's the palisade mesophyll cells near the top of the leaf. This is where the majority of photosynthesis is going to occur. And it's within these cells that you can find the greatest numbers of chloroplasts, which is the organelle where photosynthesis occurs. So we're going to take a moment to watch a video that summarizes everything we've learned so far about the basic anatomy of a leaf. And it's also going to give us a little introduction to our future topics.
So we know that plants make their own food through photosynthesis. But how does a plant get together the ingredients it needs for this? Sunlight, carbon dioxide, and water, and then combine those to create glucose and oxygen? Well, that's what leaves are for. A leaf is like a plant's food factory, and its parts work together to get the reactants into one place so that photosynthesis can happen. Let's start with sunlight. Have a look at a leaf. The top of it is exposed to the most light, so the cells specialized for trapping light are on top. These cells are called palisade mesophyll, and they're packed full of chlorophyll, the green chemical that plants use to absorb light.
I want to stop right there so that there's no confusion. The organelles, which are the dark green circles within this cell, the organelle is called a chloroplast. Within each chloroplast, there are many chlorophyll pigments. So chlorophyll is a molecule, chloroplast is an organelle. So she kind of misused that term. I don't want to confuse you. So.
That's why the top side of the leaf is darker than the bottom side. You should also note that most leaves have a large surface area, so they can trap as much sunlight as possible. What else do we need for photosynthesis? Carbon dioxide. That's where the bottom of the leaf comes in. It's got these little pores called stomata, which open up so carbon dioxide can diffuse into the leaf. They're controlled by sausage-shaped guard cells, which open up to let carbon dioxide in, but they can also close the stomata to prevent other things like water from escaping. So the carbon dioxide comes in through the stomata, makes its way through the gaps in an airy layer of cells called the spongy mesophyll at the bottom part of the leaf, and then heads out to the palisade layer for photosynthesis. Leaves are thin so that the carbon dioxide won't have too far to travel. So we've got sunlight and carbon dioxide now. What's left? Water. Water comes up through the roots and stem and enters the leaf through a vascular bundle, which contains a hollow tube for water transport called the xylem. Look at how the vascular bundle spreads out in the leaf to form veins so that it can spread water throughout. So now the leaf's palisade cells have water, carbon dioxide, and sunlight. All they need to photosynthesize and make glucose, their food, and oxygen. But how does the leaf prevent unwanted intruders like bacteria from getting in and stop important reactants from escaping? Above the palisade mesophyll and below the spongy mesophyll are epidermis cells which produce a waxy coating called the cuticle. The cuticle seals up the leaf so that the only way in and out is through the stomata, which are regulated by those guard cells. Now let's go back through the parts of a leaf, from top to bottom. We've got the thin waxy cuticle, then the epidermis cells. These basically make up the leaf's skin. Then comes the chlorophyll-rich palisade mesophyll, where the bulk of photosynthesis occurs. Below that's the spongy mesophyll, which have plenty of space in between them for reactants to move through. Through that space stretches the vascular bundle, with xylem to transport water and phloem, which transports sugars after photosynthesis. And below that, we've got another layer of epidermis and cuticle. Spaced around the lower epidermis and the cuticle are the stomata, with guard cells on either side. Leaves come in all different shapes and sizes. Look at a cabbage leaf and an oak tree leaf. But most of them have these same parts in common, which allow them to get their reactants in and perform photosynthesis.
Alright, so that was a perfect recap of everything that we've covered so far. Our next section is, how does a plant specifically acquire the reactants for photosynthesis? So how does it get carbon dioxide, and how does it get water? And that was actually covered in that video, so this will also be a review. So as we said, plants have to breathe. I don't know if you've thought of that before. They have to exchange gases with the atmosphere. And they do so using these tiny pores in the bottom side of leaves called stomata. Each stomatal pore is formed and regulated by a pair of guard cells, shown here in yellow. These are necessary because a plant needs carbon dioxide to enter these pores so that it can be transported to the palisade mesophyll cells where it can be used for photosynthesis. It's through these same pores that oxygen exits, and also, unfortunately, from the plant's perspective, where water is lost. So these pores, they're very interesting. They open and close all the time in response to a variety of stimuluses and environmental conditions, including light intensity, amount of CO2 in the atmosphere or in the leaf, whether there's pathogens around, in terms of the humidity, if the plant's undergoing drought, stress, if it's hot out. So these are really tightly regulated because, yes, a plant needs to open them to breathe in CO2, but it doesn't want to leave them open all day long because then it would dehydrate from losing a ton of water. So I actually know probably more than most people about these guard cells because I did my master's research on guard cells. I specifically studied a plant hormone called abscisic acid, also known as ABA, which allows a plant to respond to drought stress, and specifically to close its stomatal pores in response to drought. So yeah, I don't know if you realize that either. Plants have hormones just like animals. They also have an immune system as well. So pretty interesting considering they don't speak, they don't move around, but very efficient at surviving. Here's just another view of the bottom side of a leaf. So what you're looking at here, if you look at these cells, they kind of look like puzzle pieces. Those are the lower epidermal cells. And then here in like dark orange, kind of reddish, that's a pair of guard cells, and in between the two is the stomatal pore. Here's an even closer view using a fancy microscope of a pair of guard cells and the stomatal pore in between. So there's a lot going on in a leaf. Even though it's very thin, it is still several layers of tissue thick, and there's, as you just learned, several different types of tissues within a leaf. So that's how the plant accesses CO2. Next, how does a plant access water? So water is largely absorbed from the soil via the roots, and the roots transport that water and minerals upward through the stem until it gets up to the leaves, where that water can enter the palisade mesophyll cells and be used for photosynthesis. So it's the xylem, that's the specific type of vascular tissue that is used for transporting water upwards, again from the roots to the leaves. Phloem is the other type of vascular tissue. Instead, phloem transports sugars. So plants are really efficient at undergoing photosynthesis, assuming that there's water around and there's sunlight around, and they're producing large amounts of glucose and sucrose. So phloem is largely used to transport those products, those carbohydrates, to other parts of the plant that can use those carbs as an energy source. Our next topic is about the pigments that are able to absorb light during photosynthesis. And the name of these light-capturing pigments are chlorophylls. I say chlorophylls because there's different types. The most common, the most predominant is chlorophyll A, but there's also a common accessory pigment called chlorophyll B. Both of these pigments are large, complex molecules, and their job is to absorb specific colors of light emitted by the sun and to use the energy of those specific colors of light to power photosynthesis and to build glucose. Now, chlorophyll pigments don't just use any color. They specifically use two different colors of visible light, and those two different colors are a bluish violet, and the other color is red. So the two different colors that power photosynthesis are blue-violet and red. That is the reason that most photoautotrophs appear green to our eyes, because we see what is reflected from the plant. So the plant is absorbing blue light and it's absorbing red light. It doesn't absorb green and yellow light. So that's reflected. So that's what bounces back at our eyes. So it's kind of a weird thought. So like plants are almost like truly blue and red, but we see green because we see what's reflected off of them. In addition to chlorophyll A and chlorophyll B, there are other pigments within a leaf. There's a whole class called carotenoids. They have an orangish yellow color. Those are the pigments that you see in fall in deciduous trees that drop their leaves every fall. Those pigments are always there. And the reason you see them during the fall is because chlorophyll breaks down when a leaf dies, leaving behind the carotenoids, which are now visible. It is thought that those carotenoid pigments are used for helping to expand the absorption of light to generate more energy, and also some help to dissipate excess light so that the leaf doesn't burn up in the sun all day. Here we're going to talk just a little bit about the nature of light energy. So remember, there's all different types of energy in the universe. We've talked about a few so far in this class. We've talked about the chemical energy of food and electrons. We've talked about electrochemical gradients across membranes. Well, this is a third form of energy, and it's called electromagnetic radiation. As humans, we can see a certain portion of this type of energy, and that is visible light. Other forms of it are invisible to us, like for instance, microwaves, radio waves, gamma rays, X-rays, but those are all other forms of radiation as well. So we only have the ability to see a small sliver of radiation. So the colors of the rainbow are visible light, and those are a type of radiation, and it's specifically the type of radiation that a plant harnesses to power photosynthesis. And as we said before, it doesn't use the whole spectrum of the rainbow. They primarily use red and bluish violet light to power photosynthesis. So what on earth does radiation look like? Is it like an electron? What's its shape? How does it move? Well, it's a very strange particle, even strange to the physicists that study it. It behaves as both a wave and a particle. So it's like a little particle that oscillates as it moves 93 million miles from the sun until it hits the Earth. And what distinguishes various forms of radiation from one another is the frequency of their movement, or the distance of their wavelengths. So I'm kind of drawing this out with my laser. If you have a type of radiation that is moving kind of slowly and has really long, broad crests and really long wavelengths, it has less energy. So for instance, like a radio wave, it hits you and it doesn't damage you because it doesn't have a lot of energy. There's also other forms of radiation where the wavelengths are much shorter and it has more energy associated with it. So visible light is somewhere in between. If you go shorter than visible light, it starts to get dangerous for most organisms like UV light, X-rays, and gamma rays. And those forms of radiation, their wavelengths are so short, the frequency is so high, that if they were to hit your cell, there's enough energy there to break chemical bonds and, for instance, mutate your DNA, which is not a good thing. So that's a little bit about light, and it is light that a plant harnesses to do photosynthesis. In the next video, we're going to talk about more of the details of the 2 stages of photosynthesis, those being the light reactions and the Calvin cycle.